I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 107 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee. On Thursday, June the 6th, 2024, the committee is resuming a study of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. All witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. I would like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Members, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order the best we can. I do use these two cards. Yellow is 30-second warning. Red is time's up. I'll try not to cut you off mid-sentence. Now, I would like to welcome our witnesses with us today for today's study. As an individual, David Detomasi, Professor, Queen's University. David Gooderham, lawyer by video conference. Dr. Trevor Tombe, Professor of Economics, University of Calgary, by video conference. From Project Reconciliation, Stephen Mason, Chief Executive Officer and Senior Managing Director. You'll have up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Now I will begin with David Gooderham, but on video conference. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you to the committee for inviting me to appear today. Canada's declared goal, achieving net zero emissions by 2050, was incorporated into law in June 2021. Mr. Chairman, I submit that the existing legal framework is wholly inadequate to address the extreme gravity of the challenges we are facing. That is the framework of the existing legal setup. Canada's net zero plan envisions that by 2050, Canada's remaining annual emissions will be offset, balanced by carbon capture and storage and by carbon removal, CDR technologies, that will have the capability to remove massive amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere by negative emissions. A crucial unknown in this scheme is the level of Canada's remaining emissions in 2050. The plan is based on a presumption that by 2050, the remaining emissions, whatever they are, will be fully offset by CCS and CDR. The political promise is that large-scale CCS deployment, for example, will allow us to defer any near-term deep cuts in Canada's oil and gas production. Developments since 2021 compel us to reconsider this policy framework and its assumptions. The International Energy Agency released its net zero by 2050 scenario in May 2021. The IEA concluded that to give us any realistic chance to limit increased warming to 1.5 degrees, global oil production must decline 50% by 2040 and 73% by 2050. The Canada Energy Regulator's 1.5C aligned scenario, published in June 2023, accepts the accuracy of that finding by the IEA. The CER acknowledges that to align with 1.5, Canada's oil production must decline from 5.5 million barrels in 2030 to 2.8 by 2040. Further, in the fall of 2023, the IEA and several other research bodies published a series of new studies that have examined in detail the feasibility of achieving, by 2050, large-scale deployment of envisioned carbon dioxide removal technologies. They conclude that on a global scale, annual CCS capacity could possibly increase to as much as 3 billion by 2040 and as much as 6 billion per year by 2050. With respect to envisioned CDR technologies that have the capacity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, the IEA has cautioned that the annual removals of 1.7 billion tons per year are likely close to the upper bound of what is practicable by 2050. Other sources accept that it might be as much as $3 billion per year. In contrast, the annual level of emissions from oil, gas, and coal use reached 37 billion tons CO2 in 2022. Under the IEA's STEP scenario, the projected annual level declines only slightly by 2050 down to 29.5 billion. Measured against those numbers, negative emissions in the range of 6 to 8 billion tons per year are inconsequential. The opaque character of the net zero emissions concept has unfortunately allowed us to put aside any detailed public scrutiny of the hard reality, which is that meeting net zero by 2050 pledges, in the absence of deep near-term reductions in oil and gas coal production, would require deploying CDR technologies on an extraordinary scale by 2050, a scale that the IEA has described as inconceivable. I would urge this committee to undertake a full reconsideration of whether Canada's legal framework for net zero by 2050 should now be redesigned. The existing single goal, which subsumes both future reductions and removals, would be disaggregated to provide separate goals. Targets and timetables for achieving negative emissions would be separately and explicitly set out, leaving us with a separate emissions reduction target for 2050. And to conclude, promises that the CCS and CDR deployment in Canada can protect our children from warming above 1.5 C while we continue to increase our oil production in line with rising global demand are untethered from the reality we are facing. The essential and immediate requirement is to give us any remaining chance to limit warming to 1.5 is that global oil production must be reduced, sharply reduced by 2040. Equivalent cuts must be achieved in the case of natural gas. And to conclude, if that does not happen, no feasible amount of deploying CCS technology or CDR can alter the outcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your opening remarks. We'll now go to Dr. Trevor Tombe. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today about the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. Now, I'm going to focus my comments today on the financial and economic implications of the project. And this expansion was a considerable undertaking that took about 11 years from initial application to completion, more than 6 years behind schedule. And it also came with significant cost overruns, rising from an estimated $5 billion in 2013 to about $34 billion today. And so with such a high price tag, the question really is, was it worth it? And in my view, the answer is clear. Yes, it was. And it's not even close. And there's really 2 key reasons why I say that. First, taxpayers are not on the hook for the pipeline in the way that many fear. I'll clarify that in a moment. Second, the pipeline's broader economic benefits to Canada far exceed its costs. So let me start with the impact on taxpayers. There's been widespread concern that taxpayers will suffer significant losses from the government's ownership of the pipeline, given those cost overruns, but recent financial data suggests otherwise. Oil producers will cover a material portion of the cost overruns through higher tolls of roughly now about $11 per barrel. And while that's much higher than initially expected, to be sure, it's still better than relying on more expensive rail transportation options, which was the alternative. Also, much of the cost overruns for the project were financed through debt. And that's important for 2 reasons. First, any future buyer of the pipeline would not need to literally pay the full $34 billion to prevent taxpayers from losing money. The buyer instead could assume those debt obligations. Second, the interest on this debt is manageable relative to the pipeline's projected future revenues. It's anticipated to generate about $3 billion in annual revenue soon, with operating expenses well below $500 million. So even after covering the $1.6 billion in interest, there is still enough left over to start paying down that debt. And so over time, interest rates will fall, revenues will rise, and the pipeline's profitability will increase for many years to come. So in valuing the pipeline today, I think we need to account for the time value of money. And if we apply, say, a discount rate of 8% on future projected earnings from the pipeline's recent financial filings through the CER, that suggests that earnings, depending on the scenario that you look at over the next 20 years, before depreciation and interest, are valued at between 26 to 38 billion. And so if you subtract expenses, interest payments, debt repayments, and so on, it leaves you with a residual of between about 4.2 billion at the low end to 8.6 billion at the high end at the end of that 20-year horizon. And again, that's in present value terms. So there's risks with any forecasts, of course, but even with the cost overruns, the pipeline could quite easily, again, depending on the scenario, be worth more than the 4.5 billion that the government paid for it in 2018. Now, the broader economic benefits of the pipeline for Canada are also substantial. And as a piece of critical infrastructure, these broader economic benefits cannot be neglected. For oil producers, the advantages are obvious. The expected pipeline can now transport nearly 900,000 barrels per day, and that's the equivalent of about 1,300 rail cars. And that provides lower cost access to international markets, and that tends to boost prices for Canadian producers. But even producers not directly using the pipeline will benefit from narrowing of the price differential between Canadian oil and global prices. And it's difficult to say exactly by how much, and I'm not going to provide my own estimates here, but recent analysis from the CER estimated that adequate pipeline capacity could shave about $9 per barrel off of that differential. And given Canada's daily oil production, these gains add up fast. So using the 2016 Energy Future Report, for example, from the CER, you can estimate that between now and 2040, the costs to Canada's economy would be nearly $240 billion in today's dollars if we didn't expand pipeline infrastructure. And so projects like Trans Mountain avoids those large costs. And so these economic gains suggest the pipeline will more than pay for itself in terms of higher GDP, and those benefits accrue far beyond Alberta as well. So in closing, and I do see, Mr. Chair, the yellow signal here, I'll note that none of what I've said here justifies the major cost overruns, and investigations into the causes to avoid repeating the same mistakes are important to undertake. But despite the delays and added costs, the pipeline remains an incredibly valuable asset and a crucial piece of infrastructure for Canada's economy. So thank you. I look forward to the questions and conversations to come.
Thank you for your opening remarks. We'll now go to David Detomasi. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. Great. Thank you again for the committee for inviting me here and allowing me to speak. My name is David Detomasi. As mentioned, I'm a professor at the Smith School of Business at Queen's. And I recently published an article entitled a book entitled Profits and Power, Navigating the Politics and Geopolitics of Oil. As one of the context of that book, that I'm writing my second one, and will offer the comments to you today based on what I'm writing now, which is I would like to begin speaking about why our economic bounty in Canada offers us a luxury of choice that most other countries in the world simply do not have. There are clearly many people in Canada, many Canadians, who either wish we perhaps did not have them or we didn't develop them. I would like to offer some insights into the global system that they might consider while they make those judgments. So, and I would like these arguments to be put in the record for our consideration of Trans Mountain. First of all, the reality of the current energy system, which needs, I think, increasingly Canadians should focus on the world around us. Canada's current abundance in energy, along with its abundance of food, timber, and other resources, is a historical rarity. And the idea that we would voluntarily constrict them is as modern an idea as our idea of restricting food intake to reduce obesity. Almost nobody else in the world has this concern. I would argue that the biggest problem the world energy system has to date is too many people have too little energy, not enough. There are 2 billion people in the world, of the world's 8, that live in dire energy poverty on a day-to-day basis. There are 4 billion people in the world that have access to energy, but it's not regular, it's not predictable, and it doesn't allow them to develop their full potential. If an overriding general goal of a Canadian value is the alleviation of human misery, and any progress toward that goal must pay attention to solving the energy problem for the world's poor and the increasing energy demand from the rapidly industrializing world. To do that, we need to recognize some clear facts. Energy use is going to grow, and I believe carbon energy will grow in volume as well. Many parts of the world, including the continent of Africa, 2 billion people, are just beginning their growth and industrializing journey, and my last figure says the entire continent of Africa uses less energy than the state of California. If it continues in the same growth trajectory, India's energy profile today resembles what China's was in the year 2000, and it shows every intention of following China's path. So in 20 years, its energy use will likely be very close to what China's is now, and China will continue to grow. Carbon now sits at about 83% of the world's energy mix, and even if we're able to reduce that percentage to, say, 70% by 2050 or 60%, it would still be a large percentage of a very large pie. Carbon use is not going anywhere in the world. In fact, it's going to increase substantially. Third, energy production is a critical element of geopolitical competition. Canada's impact on the broader geopolitical affairs might seem modest. We only have 40 million people in a country in a world of 8 billion. But we punch way above our weight in hockey, in maple syrup, and in oil and gas and development. Recent world events in the Ukraine, particularly, as well as others, indicate that security of energy supply is paramount, both to people I've just mentioned and to our allies, who have asked us repeatedly to provide them that security. Countries that are well supplied with energy worry less about acquiring more of it, worry less about their neighbors, spend less money on defense, fight fewer wars, and have fewer civil conflicts. And I can show you the research to back all of that up. Third, energy production is critical to the economic welfare of our country, which is showing some worrisome signs currently. I'm sure the committee is very much aware of Canada's lagging productivity challenge. The value of our output per worker is dropping. The problem is recognized by our current finance minister in repeated budget documents, and the deputy governor of the Bank of Canada recently went so far as to label the productivity problem as a full-blown national crisis. To put it clearly, 20 years ago, Canada's productivity level generated an income per capita that was roughly equivalent to among the more wealthy American states. Today, we are slightly behind Alabama in GDP per capita, which is one of the United States' poorest states. In order for us to generate high and growing living standards with Canadian energy development, I think, is a key part of that puzzle. Are losing ground in the ability to generate wealth and prosperity. At present, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development predicts Canada will be the worst performing economy of its member states and will remain that way for the next 3 decades. Our debt levels continue to rise, our debt servicing costs are growing, and including former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge has drawn attention to this being worrisome as best. Canada's most productive and profitable export-driven industry is oil and gas and mining. These generate the highest amount of wealth per hour of labor worked, and they are also by far our most valuable export. As recently reported by Jock Finlayson in the Globe and Mail, without energy exports, our cumulative trade deficit over the past decade would measure well over $1 trillion. As with oil and gas, we are more or less at balance. Exporting resources generates the earnings that we need to purchase the benefits of goods and services the world over, and helps generate the money that we need to fund the social programs that Canadians increasingly rely upon across the country. If we do not have these industries, if we do not develop them effectively, the results will be devastating for the Canadian economy and our social programs. Final point I'll make is developing natural resources responsibly can be an expression and reaffirmation of Canadian values. Simply, Canadians clearly want economic activity to occur in a sustainable, environmentally aware way, one that acknowledges and respects the rights of Indigenous peoples. Let me be clear. This is not always the case in oil and gas development around the world. In fact, it is rarely the case that that is so. But increasingly, as people become wealthier and as people
understand, I just ask you to wrap up. We're over time.
We are going, our capacity to export the things we have learned in the production of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and our relationships with Indigenous peoples will serve Canada well as we export and work our magic abroad. I'm done. Thank you.
Petit rappel amical, Monsieur le Président.
A friendly reminder, Mr. Chair. If the witnesses try to keep a slower pace, because that's better for interpretation. Just a reminder. If they could just slow down a little bit, please.
Thank you, Mr. Smart, for that reminder. If I just ask the witnesses, I think it's been pretty good overall, but just to slow down for interpretation. And we will now go to you, Mr. Mason. You have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak to you today on the future of Trans Mountain. As I was introduced, I am the founder and managing director of a vision called Project Reconciliation that has been 7 years looking at a need to change the model on how we, under the constitutional duty to consult to get major infrastructure projects like Trans Mountain permitted. It's not a conversation about promising jobs where we're building it that go away once once the project's built. But it's a conversation about having material equity ownership. I'm also the chair and CEO of a company called Reconciliation Energy Transition. We hold a major carbon hub in the Calgary area, and all of that has material Indigenous partnerships. Project Reconciliation has a clear and bold vision in that we are finance, governance, and ownership allocation ready to facilitate up to a 100% Indigenous ownership of Trans Mountain. This is about creating a path towards economic reconciliation where Indigenous communities are not just participants, as I just pointed out, but leaders in major projects through material equity ownership. Project Reconciliation will have no ownership of Trans Mountain. We are ready to facilitate the purchase from Canada at commercial value, and I underline commercial value. This is not an ask to give this to Indigenous peoples, that the Indigenous peoples, and we are finance ready, will purchase this asset from the federal government at commercial value. And this to go to 120 plus impacted nations. This would establish a foundation for Indigenous generational wealth, weaving Indigenous governance with corporate governance to foster economic independence and economic stewardship. Our plan ensures that Indigenous communities impacted by the pipeline will benefit economically. The sale of Trans Mountain to Indigenous ownership is not just an economic transaction. It is a significant step towards financial sovereignty for Indigenous nations. This ownership would enable communities to reinvest in housing, education, social services, training and development of Indigenous youth, and invest in other infrastructure projects addressing the long-standing challenges as well as the reinvestments. At heart in this vision is the Indigenous Sovereign Wealth Fund. It was a vision that came that the ownership would lead to a generational wealth base, much like what Norway did in creating the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, that this would be a creation of a generational Indigenous Sovereign Wealth Fund, where Indigenous populations thrive at all Canadians benefit. Prosperous Indigenous communities strengthen local economies, contribute to a more robust workforce, and foster national unity. By enabling the Indigenous participation in early in major projects, we ensure that development is sustainable, inclusive, and aligned with Canada's broader goals of economic growth, social justice, and environmental responsibility. I tabled the first offer to purchase 51% of Trans Mountain on July 2019 to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. I had the National Bank of Canada and the chairman of Project Reconciliation with me in the meeting. Minister Morneau liked the proposal that was addressing a commercial value transaction, an ownership model that gave an allocation of ownership reflecting the individual nation's proximity to the right-of-way, and a population weighting, and a governance structure that provided the voice at the table. Minister Morneau basically stated the government of Canada was going to just build it first and then look to divest it. And here we are 7 years later. Well, actually, if I do the math, 5 years later. 7 before we got ready to table the offer. He stated material equity ownership needed to be the solution. The divestiture of Trans Mountain is an opportunity to not only fulfill a commitment to reconciliation, but really to make an active verb out of that noun of undelivered promise. but also to create a future where Indigenous communities are full economic partners in Canada's prosperity. Real economic reconciliation will take all of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working together to create Indigenous capital for future projects. In doing so, we can change the existing business model, grow annual distributions, and support community services for future generations. As Future Economy Reports notes, closing the gap in opportunities for Indigenous communities would boost Canada's GDP by $27.7 billion annually, an increase of 1.5%. This sale is more than just an economic benefit. It's about building a new table where Indigenous communities are leaders in decision-making, helping to build stronger and more inclusive Canada. While Project Reconciliation has been in a holding pattern, waiting for the completion of the pipeline, we have moved forward with Reconciliation Energy Transition as the basis to facilitate material Indigenous equity partnerships in energy transition projects. RIDI was awarded the CCS project for the Greater Calgary area. The project also includes a sustainable aviation fuel project that will provide sustainable aviation fuel to Calgary International Airport. And RIDI has partnered with Sumitomo Corporation of the Americas in the hub.
Mr. Mason, I just ask you to wrap up. You're at the end of time.
Done.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you. And to all our witnesses, I'll just remind you again at the end of the meeting, if there's anything you missed, you can provide a brief to the committee clerk as well. I will now proceed with our first round of questioning, and we'll begin with Ms. Stubbs. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair.
Is it
So anything on French, we're not getting any.
okay? We'll suspend for a moment. Okay, we are back. Now we'll proceed with Ms. Stubbs. Ms. Stubbs, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, all of the witnesses, for being here today, and thank you in particular to the witnesses who spoke so eloquently and powerfully about the way that TMX and pipelines in general and oil and gas development benefit all of Canada, that this essential infrastructure is crucial to Canada's national interest and also crucial to helping support allies around the world. Thank you for so accurately explaining the ways in which energy development in oil and gas is absolutely critical to human flourishing around the world. And also for outlining the reconciliation opportunities related to this essential infrastructure. Dr. Toom, I might start with you related to the cost overruns, given your focus in your presentation. As you have outlined, of course, the government has overseen just this staggering, ridiculous cost overrun on the expansion, which started with a private sector estimate of about $5.4 billion, and as you explained, has ballooned to $34 billion today. Could you give the committee some insights onto how these cost overruns occurred, how this estimate got so out of whack, and if you have any comments on any of the government's anti-resource development policies that contributed to those cost overruns, which ones they were and how that happened?
Great question. I won't be able to provide a precise quantitative answer to that. I think much more investigation is warranted into what the precise factors were behind those cost overruns, and there were many. I think regulatory barriers that have ratcheted up in recent years. And I say this not just because of recent changes in federal policy, but early on in the pipeline's efforts to get off the ground. There were challenges with the British Columbia provincial government, for example, as well as Kinder Morgan was trying to get that project over the line. There were also non-regulatory barriers as well. The simultaneous construction of Site C and Coastal GasLink, for example, does represent some competition for resources and skilled labor, if you will, that can increase costs of all of those projects together. Conditions on the ground also worked out or turned out to differ significantly from those initial estimates. And then on top of all of this, COVID-19 and associated rapid price increases for certain key materials in the construction sector overall were also a factor. So I'd say that a lot of unfortunate challenges did face the project, but regulatory delays, certainly a big one. You know, these kind of very large projects do incur considerable costs prior to any construction activity at all. And thinking about not just the regulatory burden that proponents need to overcome, but the rapid and uncertain changes in the regulatory environment also make it more difficult to plan and navigate these kind of large-scale infrastructure projects well.
Thank you, Dr. Tuman. Of course, one of the key failures was that the government could have declared the Trans Mountain expansion in the general advantage of Canada. And there were certainly things that the federal government could have done to clear the way for that pipeline that had been approved to get built by the private sector in the first place. And so thank you for that insight. And your comments on the issue. I note also you made the comment about adequate pipeline capacity. I'd ask you if you think Canada actually has enough right now. Of course, we common sense conservatives are very pro-pipeline on this side, and I think it is, well, we know the fact that there actually isn't sufficient pipeline capacity right now to continue to be able to expand production and exports. But if you could expand a bit more on this issue around tolls, you of course, they're expected to be charged for cost recouping. Can you give any insight on how much higher you expect those tolls to be? The fact that the CER has said they won't be finally decided on until 2025. If they're expected to be higher, what are the factors and the impacts driving that?
So that's a complicated question. I won't speculate around where the final tolls will end up. You know, right now the interim tolls at about $11 per barrel for the full shipment from Alberta to the coast is roughly double what the initial estimates were. A portion of that is tied to the construction cost increases. So for certain components of the project, there is scope to pass through construction cost increases to producers in the form of these higher tolls. But what the CER is going to look at is, to dramatically oversimplify it, what do the tolls need to be to ensure the viability of the pipeline itself? You know, that's typically how we approach these kind of regulated assets.
Do you have any comment on implications for, if you would expand on your further comments about implications for taxpayers, either out of pocket or in tax revenues?
Sure. So the debt that was used to finance the construction does represent a risk to taxpayers in the form of future revenues of the pipeline not being enough to cover the interest and repayment obligations of that debt. I do tend to be fairly optimistic for the oil and gas sector in Canada overall, and anticipate that this is a project that will be used for several decades to come. And if the pipeline is used, then it will generate sufficient revenue to cover these debt costs, both interest and future repayment. So if we use the pipeline, then taxpayers will not directly be on the hook for these increased costs. That really is shifted in large part to producers in the form of higher tolls.
Thank you, Dr. Toom. We'll now go to Vivian Lapointe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. My first question will go to Professor Detomasi. The Indo-Pacific region as a whole is becoming a bigger player in the global economy. And in your opinion, how can Canada leverage the TMX pipeline to become a significant player in the Indo-Pacific's economic development? And what industries beyond oil and gas might benefit from this infrastructure?
Okay, a couple of things that are critical about that question. You're absolutely right. The bulk of the world's chunk of economic growth and energy growth is going to come from that region, and that's going to be true for the next several decades. And getting Canadian oil and gas to Tidewater, there is a strong case why we should do that, simply because it's a shorter route, it's cheaper in terms of that, it's less expensive to liquefy the natural gas, and so there's all kinds of reasons, economically speaking. Geopolitically speaking, I think it'd be better to widen their supplier base, because what I'm noticing right now, and this is in the case of Russia, is that their economy is actually rebounding very strongly, even after all the sanctions Western countries have put on them in the Ukraine war. And they're doing that primarily by selling oil and gas to the Indo-Pacific region, roughly from India all the way to China. And that is collecting in them a infrastructure network that binds them ever more closer to Russia. So geopolitically, that's a mistake. After if you can sort of view oil and gas and resource development as a bridge to a new region, right? Canadians have always been known for resource development, and that's always what we've been thought about. But we've been working very hard for decades to say we do other things too, but nobody ever quite believes us. So one of the things I think we should perhaps do is, as we develop more advanced technologies in oil and gas, we can sell them to that region. The technologies we develop will be our linchpin to have the higher value-added stuff, and can then be used, hopefully our green technologies, so that their oil and gas in use can then be sold and developed in a way that's cognizant of Canadian values. So that's probably how I would go with that answer.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Toom. How does the TMX pipeline strengthen Canada's position as a global energy player, and how important is this in the context of evolving geopolitical dynamics, particularly with regard to energy security?
Great question there. And we should keep in mind that prior to the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, the overwhelming majority of oil production in Canada was shipped to the United States. And so largely we're the supplier to effectively just one market. And this expanded pipeline, which is the first new pipeline to the West Coast in over 70 years, allows for a much broader set of potential markets and buyers for Canadian oil. And so with this project, and in the future potentially others, expanding the number of potential buyers beyond the United States strengthens Canada's economic position, but also dampens the risk that we face given the potential for policy changes in the United States. And so diversifying the set of markets means that we have a much more secure set of options for our industry here.
And what are the economic implications of the TMX pipeline for Canadian provinces in ensuring a stable access to energy resources? And how might this affect domestic energy pricing and availability?
So the main economic implication of this pipeline expansion and export infrastructure in general is to shrink the gap between prices received by oil producers here and world prices abroad. So it's projects like this that shrinks that differential, which increases the amount received per barrel by producers here. This flows then through to benefit Canada's economy through several channels. First, to the extent that it facilitates more investment and production in the sector, it's going to mean greater input purchases of goods and services supplied to the sector by businesses located all throughout Canada, so large interprovincial trade implications. There's also government revenue that is earned federally through, primarily through higher corporate income taxes, in Alberta through both income taxes but also royalty revenues, and personal income taxes paid by higher earnings of both owners and workers within the sector. So there's various research that exists around how different provinces benefit from oil prices. And of course, provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador benefit more as these are larger sectors as a share of their economy. But nearly all provinces benefit from higher oil prices. With the notable exception of New Brunswick, just because of the much higher share of refining activity that occurs there. And so it's purchasing oil as an input, but that's kind of unique. Other provinces from Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia benefit when oil prices are higher.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now go to Monsieur Simard for 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I have a question for you, Dr. Toom. I hope that you can hear me. I hope that the interpretation is working. Great. First of all, I'd like you to be indulgent because I'm not an economist. And my friend Jean-Denis Garon is an economist and thinks that I make some interesting conclusions when I talk about economics. Based on my read of the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report from 2022, who said that $20.4 billion of the pipeline is not profitable. So what you're saying at $40 billion, the pipeline can be profitable. Is that correct?
On future projections for revenues of the pipeline, anticipated costs, debt service implications. And I note that the PBO's analysis that I believe you are referring to is completed prior to the latest financial projections filed with the Canada Energy Regulator by the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation just earlier this year. So my comments were based on those filings, which themselves are based on the interim toll rate that we now know, but didn't before, and much more precise projections around revenues, interest costs, operating expenditures of the project itself.
OK, parfait. Je comprends bien. De toute façon.
Okay, so I understand. So I don't think that the PBO will be tabling another report, an update with a pipeline that costs $34 billion. But I'd like to come back to something. And as I said, I don't have a lot of background in economics. It seems to me that the first principle in economics is that when you look at a project, we look at the risk. And I get the impression that in the TMX pipeline, no one was ready to assume the risk except for the government. So with my lack of knowledge in economics, I'm having a hard time understanding how a project where no one wanted to take on the risk can become profitable. Perhaps you can explain to me.
Very good question. There are two broad types of risks that we should keep in mind. One is about the regulatory risks, the construction hurdles that the project proponent needs to overcome, the uncertainty around even just the regulatory environment, if we think back a few years ago, is a fundamentally different type of risk that a private proponent faced prior to the completion of the project that the government itself doesn't, in the sense that it's, again, to oversimplify it, the source of a lot of that risk. But now that the project is complete, all of that risk is no longer relevant. What's relevant is the risks to the pipeline's utilization rate in the future. What does oil production look like? How much of the pipeline is actually utilized, and over what future time horizon? And that's much more of a market risk, if you will.
Désolé, j'ai pas
I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time. Just to understand this, I asked you a fairly simple question. Without government participation, would a project like this be possible? Yes or no? I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. I'm not trying to trap you with this question.
In a stable, predictable, and sensible regulatory regime, a project like this is possible, put forward by private proponents.
Merci. J'aime.
Thank you. I like your answer. So perhaps you could apply the same logic to clean tech, clean energy. So a stable system, is one where we would price carbon, and in order to have clean tech, we would need to have a price on carbon. I'm not putting words in your mouth, but could we apply the same logic to clean energy?
I think we could apply the same logic throughout the economy, that a stable, predictable, sensible regulatory regime does provide an incentive for businesses to proceed with investments in large-scale projects.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you. Do I have a bit of time left? Great. Thank you. Mr. De Tomasi, you talked about energy security, and you talked about the possibility of selling technologies that could be developed for carbon capturing. The question that comes to my mind is, people are withdrawing from research in this new technology. So do you think there is potential to sell technology for which large corporations seem to be a lot less enthusiastic about moving forward?
In the carbon world or in the clean tech world?
Les clean tech, oui.
Okay. Yeah, well, I'd have to look up exactly how much is being done, but my sense is there is a fair amount of research being done in the clean tech world. And a lot of it isn't commercialized yet. A lot of it exists very heavily. In fact, if I was God, and told you what to do, I would say you need investing in primary research at universities. Of course, that's where I work. Is probably the number one thing one can do to increase our ability to compete in the clean tech space. And once we get better knowledge and skills, entrepreneurs will take it and run with it, just like they did in Silicon Valley and led the tech rev.
Merci. Mais est-ce qu'il y a pas, ça va être très...
Thank you. Do I have time for another quick question? Is there not a way...
On s'essaye,
I didn't want to cut off Mr. De Tomasi, so maybe on the next round, okay? Thank you. We'll now proceed to welcome to committee Mr. Boulris. Great to have you, and you have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the preliminary comments that I would like to make to the committee, I can't remain silent about the shocking aspect of some of the comments that I heard from witnesses. It's as if there were a willful ignorance of science. I get the impression that it's as if there were no COP meetings, there were no reports by the IPCC. The planet is burning and our children's future is at risk, and we have people who say, well, we're accelerating into a wall, and we should go even faster. So I'm really quite thrown off by this. It's as if there were a lack of consciousness of the situation we are currently in with climate change year after year. This is not new. And once again, this year, this is the hottest year in history with the greatest increase in temperature. And that has a huge impact on drought, flooding, forest fires, and we're being encouraged to use more fossil fuels and pump more oil. It's quite shocking. My question is for Mr. Gooderham. You made the most reasonable arguments here, in my opinion. To reach a net zero plan for 2050, there is a drastic drop in fossil fuels. You said 50% by 2030, that's in 6 years, and 80% by 2050 if we're serious, or otherwise we're not serious, and we say good luck to our children and grandchildren. How is that compatible with purchasing a pipeline that will increase barrels exponentially. How do you reconcile those two things?
Sorry, I'm not getting the translation.
Oh.
Although I get the gist of the question, I somehow have got to.
Okay, we'll suspend for just a moment. After my introductory remarks, my question for Mr. Gooderham was, you presented a net zero plan for 2050 that included a drastic drop in fossil fuel production, 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. Today we are studying the impact of the purchase of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and its expansion, which triples capacity and which adds 600,000 barrels a day to oil production. In your opinion, is that compatible with not only the Paris Accord objectives, but tripling pollution?
All right. I think that part of the answer, and to link it to the broad question of your hearing, a moment ago, I think Mr. Toom said that risks to pipeline utilization lie in the future, and one would be, in effect, I would suggest, would be the level of global oil demand. And if we see a drop in global oil demand in line with the IEA 1.5 scenario, or indeed the Canadian Energy Regulators global net zero scenario, they're the same. Global demand will drop dramatically between 2030 and 2040. Exactly how that translates into the utilization of the TMX pipeline and the valuation of it, I'm not in a position to answer. But it would seem to me it is an extraordinarily dramatic change in circumstances. And for that reason, when I began my submission, I commented that I did not think the existing legal framework is adequate to address the extreme gravity of the challenges we face. And I'm looking at two challenges. One is the climate challenge and the requirement for very dramatic action in the very short term. And the other challenge is the economic challenge, because if we respond to that, it will have a dramatic effect on many, many aspects of the Canadian economy and the oil and gas industry. And I don't discount the seriousness of those impacts. So I'm saying we should have our eyes fully open to at least consider the possibility that the world will respond within time to the crushing impacts of climate change that are coming upon us. And to just conclude my answer to you, that the global carbon budget for 1.5 degrees is about 270 billion tons of carbon. That's all that's remaining to allow us to stay within 1.5. That will be exhausted within the next 7 years. After that, all emissions from global fossil fuel production, and I mean, they will go on after 2030 at some rate, some level, even declining. All of that's going into the atmosphere. And it will all be driving the temperature above 1.5, which means that if we ever want to get back to a safe level of warming in the world, we will have to have massive capacity to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And essentially what we're doing at the moment is we are deferring the cost and possibilities of that to our children and grandchildren after 2050. They will pay the cost if it's feasible. So it seems to me that a true economic analysis would take these two problems and look at them together to truly understand what it means if we keep producing more oil. I hope that's answered your question.
Merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie. C'était très clair.
Thank you very much. That was very clear and very enriching. And to come back to the pipeline purchase as such, which cost Canadian taxpayers $34 billion, don't you think that it is an immense direct and indirect subsidy to the oil industry?
If you're still addressing that to me, I do. In my view, it is because it's in effect. The oil industry gets the benefits of what might be, say, another. I hope it's not, but another 10 or 15 years of very high levels of oil production. The industry gets the economic benefit of that. Our children and grandchildren will pay for the cost, the true cost of that, which will be, if it's possible, the carbon removal, which isn't conceivable going to begin until after about 2050. So we're basically shifting the economic benefit to the present generation, and all of that benefit's going to come out of the pockets of the next generation.
Thank you. We'll now go to our next round of questioning. We'll begin with Mr. Falk. You have 5 minutes.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all the witnesses for coming here this morning. And before I ask the witnesses any question, I just want to make sure that the record records what Mr. Simard and the Block's position is on clean tech. And that's the only way clean tech energy is affordable is if fossil fuel energy becomes unaffordable through a carbon tax. So let's have a carbon tax election and decide that right now.
Right. Right on.
So, but anyway, so thank you for stating your position. I would like to start with Mr. Tomby. Mr. Tomby, thank you for your comments. You talked about tolls. Could you tell the committee what tolls were prior to 2019 on the TMX?
Off the top of my head, no, but I want to say on the order of $3 to $4 per barrel, plus or minus $1 here or there.
Warren, you said currently they're at 11?
Yeah, for the incremental interim tolls. Those are the final tolls that will be determined later by the CER.
Okay.
But yeah,
and
11, and that's roughly.
They've indicated in 2025 they're going to make their decision on what that final toll will be. And that'll be on presumably the final cost, which we really don't know. The latest figure we know is $34 billion, but we really don't know what the final cost will be at this point. If it's $34 billion, what do you expect the tolls will have to be?
So that's not an answer that I would like to speculate about. I suspect, though, that the interim tolls are informative about what the final tolls may end up being.
Okay,
so
thank you.
Something of that order.
You'd also talked about the significant cost overruns from in the last 5 years on that project. How do we determine what those costs are? The overruns.
Well, that's something where I would hope that future investigations will be able to shed a lot more detailed light on. For example, the Auditor General potentially taking a look at.
So you think the Auditor General would be a good place to start with doing an investigation as to cost overruns?
I would value such a report, speaking personally, yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mason, I would like to shift a few questions over to you. Thank you also for your comments. You said your group would be prepared to buy the project at commercial value. What is commercial value?
Well, that's a very good question, Mr. Falk. It will get down to what ultimately the tolls settle out at that will then drive the determination of what the commercial value is. But I just wanted to stress in my comments, this is not about looking at the government as a giveaway to the Canadian or to the Indigenous Canadians.
I understand that. I just wondered if you already had earmarked, because you said everything was in place, your financing's in place. So to what level are you expecting to finance this project?
Well, we are expecting to finance to 100% purchase on ultimately what the tolls settle out at that will then drive what the commercial value is.
So you're looking at the commercial value not on a construction cost basis, but on a valuation approach.
Well, that's really what drives it. And, you know, there were some acts of God that contributed to the cost overrun,
Sure.
like fires and floods and COVID.
Okay,
Not-
but I
not
want
to
to back
mention-
up.
Sorry.
I understand that, Mr. Mason, but I want to back up to a comment you made. You said you were in discussions with Mr. Morneau to purchase the pipeline,
51%.
51%, and you were obviously happy with the $4.5 billion price tag at that time and with the $5 billion projected cost to build the expansion.
At the time we tabled the offer to purchase, the estimate on the CapEx at that point was 12.6 billion.
Yeah, it had grown by about $2 billion.
Well, it went from 5 to 7 and then jumped to 12.6 and then jumped to 21.4.
So have you been following the construction costs? Like you did talk a little, I cut you off and I apologize for that. You were talking a little bit about some of the cost overruns. But the acts of God that the project experienced don't account for nearly all of the cost overruns. We know that some of the contractors were replaced midstream. There would have been some severance packages paid out and single source contracting to some preferable contractors. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, we weren't at that level, but certainly what caused a significant portion of the cost overrun is the permits getting pulled at least 3 times because they were challenged in courts by the constitutional duty to consult that it wasn't thorough enough.
So who pulled the permits?
The regulator pulled the permits by court order until they were satisfied that the constitutional duty to consult with the landowners, being the Indigenous peoples, met its full obligation. That pipe was sitting on the ground for many, many years while the permits were in a holding pattern.
Yeah.
And it looks like we're getting the red flag here.
Oh, man, I wasn't nearly done.
Well, you'll
we
get
can
another
meet after.
round to ask more questions. Thank you, Mr. Falk. Now go to Mr. Jawari for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you to all witnesses for coming here today and for your testimony. Most of my questions are going to focus around the economic benefit, and I'm going to start with Mr. Di Tommaso. In a 2021 article, you said, and I'll quote, Canada must cultivate a positive but realistic energy relationship with the United States. The U.S. still absorbed over 90% of Canada's oil export. This is too much customer concentration. What do you really mean by customer concentration, and what's the impact in Canada, not only on dependency but also in economic GDP?
Sure. There's 2 or 3 answers to that question. What we teach our business school students is it's never wise to have one customer for your product because that customer exerts power over you in a way that you don't want. Second thing I talk about in my course is I think one of the biggest myths in Canadian economic thought is that the Americans are always our friends. And sometimes they are, and sometimes they aren't, and it's up to them which one role they play. And we have an election coming up, and it's a wild card now who will win. But to automatically assume that the U.S. will take decisions, at least thinking about us, is wrong. I don't think that they do have evidence they do that. In fact, when we originally negotiated the free trade agreement in 99, 90, and 91, the Americans were interested in our energy. That's what brought them to the table. Now they're not because they have plenty of their own.
Can you bring it down to the dollar per barrel? What that 90% customer concentration and our dependency on having only one customer? How did that translate into $1 per barrel?
I'd have to work that through then about how much that was costing. I was more worried about what the power that they could exert over our
Is there
economics.
any range you can share with us?
Any what?
Any range between X amount of dollars to X amount of dollars?
15, perhaps. Something
15?
like that.
Okay,
15.
great. Thank you. So $15 a barrel. So I'm going to switch now to Mr. Tom. And in your article on the Hub, you emphasize that the economic benefit of the Trans Mountain Pipeline far exceeds its cost. Could you expand on how these benefits will manifest across Canada, particularly the region outside of Alberta, with the fact that if we assume that $15 a barrel, how does that translate? And in your benefit analysis, did you take that into consideration when you look at the economic benefit in as much as an opportunity loss if we hadn't built the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
That's right. So in that article, I used a $9 per barrel estimate of what the effect of sufficient pipeline capacities would be on that differential. And that would be on all oil produced, on average. And so that translates into considerable increases in revenue received by that sector and directly into GDP overall, and not just Alberta. So in 2019, for example, which unfortunately is the latest year of data that I have on this.
My apology for interrupting. Can you give me a number, a range? You mentioned billions of dollars. I think 240.
That's right. So if you look over the 25-year period between 2016 to 2040, when I did this analysis, that would add up in today's dollars to about $240 billion. Overall,
so just clarification, on a $9 a barrel, $245 billion. And if we're talking about a $15 a barrel, now we're talking about nearly $500 billion.
Well, potentially. It would certainly be higher if you thought the effect on the differential was larger.
Great. And I did interrupt you, but I was asking you to also talk about the economic benefit, and, the broader economic benefit outside of Alberta.
That's right. So just to provide an example about how much the oil and gas extraction sector in Alberta purchases from others elsewhere, if you add them in with refined product producers here in the province, Alberta purchases about $13 billion per year in goods and services from businesses outside the province. $5.5 billion, for example, from Ontario alone. So those supply chain connections are.
So I'd like to close by saying that we basically saved an opportunity loss of $245 billion by building this pipeline. Thank you.
I agree, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Jwari. We'll now go to Monsieur Smart for 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you to my friend Ted. I agree with him. I would like there to be an election on the carbon tax. It would be fun. Perhaps we won't see your leader then. Well, in any case. Mr. de Thomasie, I have a quick, simple question for you. You were talking about the possibility of selling new technologies. And I have a visit in my head of Minister Wilkinson in Berlin at Siemens. And Siemens clearly said to the minister, we'll never see the day where we produce hydrogen from gas and carbon capture because the technological cost is much too high. No one will get into it. And it made me think, because if we did want to launch this new technology, there's a lot of promise, but I get the impression that it doesn't deliver much. And if I look at the movement of companies in Quebec, we have a problem in that it's that everyone wants to come to Quebec, but there's not enough energy offers. So Quebec is very attractive, but I don't see the same thing for companies who want to go to Alberta saying, well, I want to produce here who has aluminum and carbon capture. Aren't we just sort of dreaming about all of these new technologies that will reduce our carbon footprint in the oil and gas sector?
Yep. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think a couple of things, the history of innovation is probably helpful to look at here. They said exactly the same thing about fracking for 50 years, that it would never work, it would never be profitable, and one determined entrepreneur spent tens of millions of his own dollars and proved that it could. There are numerous examples of technologies. Now, innovation is a messy business. Innovation is a slow business until it's not. And then I would reference Matt Ridley's work on this. It's a messy, slow, until we hit something and then it takes off. We just don't know when that's going to be.
Donc, tout à fait, j'aime bien votre réponse.
So I like your answer. So we don't know what direction things are moving in, but it's possible that innovation will mean that we set aside the oil and gas sector. It's possible that wind power and solar power will develop so quickly that we will set aside the oil and gas sector. Do you think?
And we're very short because we're out of time.
No. I mean, not by itself, because we still have problems with intermittency, we still have problems with reliability, and it gets damn cold in Canada, so we need a backup.
Thank you. Mr. Boulris has shared his time with Mr. Morris. So, Mr. Morris, you have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur Boulris.
Thank you, Mr. Boulris.
Grad myself, I understand we got some business profs in this room. What I learned at Laurier in my business training is we got to listen to experts and think long term. So I'd like to introduce a quote from an expert in this area on climate science, Professor Jim Scaia, co-chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 3. This is back in April of 2022. Quote, Dr. Scaia says, "It's now or never if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees C without immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, it will be impossible." End quote. Now, I think part of why climate scientists like Jim Scaia have spoken about this urgency is my understanding of the climate science is we have feedback loops. So last year in Canada, our emissions were 702 megatons. The emissions from the wildfires that become more extreme and more frequent because of the climate crisis, those emissions don't show up in our climate balance sheet, but they were 647 megatons. And that's before the Jasper wildfires and all the devastation that was there. Part of how we try to make sense of that is there's the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon attempts to reflect the reality of the damages from carbon in the atmosphere at this stage of the climate crisis. It's used by countries around the world, including Canada and the United States. ECCC estimates the social cost of carbon to be $294 per ton. To Dr. Toom, my question for you, in your assessment of the TMX being worth every penny, have you included the social cost of carbon in that assessment? Yes or no?
Yes, and I'm happy to expand.
Okay. So the social cost of carbon is $294 a ton. The TMX pipeline is 84 megatons. That's another $24.7 billion to the cost of the 35 from before. Is your math different?
Yes.
Do you want to share it?
Yeah, certainly. So much depends on who takes up the slack of the barrels of oil that we don't supply. So if the production shifts, for example, to certain fields in Saudi Arabia, then you can get roughly equivalent to about $1,000 per ton in economic costs incurred in Canada for the net avoided emissions. So in that sense, blocking pipelines is a very high cost way and higher than the SEC approach to lowering emissions.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Patzer for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mason, just had a couple quick questions for you first. We heard earlier today that we're looking at about $11 per barrel on the toll rate right now. So just wondering, what would the commercial value of the pipeline be, do you think, at $11 a barrel on that toll? What would that commercial value be?
Well, that's a really good question, and I should have my finance guys with me. I'm not here to pick what the number of commercial value is today. It really has to get down to what ultimately the CER decides is what the shippers have to bear in terms of that cost overruns. I think a big chunk of that cost overruns, as I started to mention before I got pulled, was the delays on the permits. And I mean, that pipe sat on the ground for 5+ years. And the standby cost contributed significantly beyond the acts of God of And when places like Jasper burn, the taxpayer steps up and helps to rebuild. There is a basis that some of that cost overrun, when it attributes to floods, fires, and COVID, shouldn't necessarily be all bore by the shippers. The regulator, there's a capped and uncapped portion of the existing contracts. There needs to be a regulator opinion on how much falls into each category. You know, in terms of the original tolls, it was brought up at $3 for line 1. I mean, that line was built over 70 years ago. That capital has been fully depreciated. And the key piece to that was really driven by the operating cost, not a return on capital that's been fully depreciated. But I would like to add one more comment. As we got into the finance readiness, and we had the banks, and we had a series of bonds planned. I was in and out of New York 3 or 4 times talking to bond desks. We had the bonds priced as support by the National Bank of Canada. And what got to that point of what was left, for what does it mean for you as an Indigenous owner? It amounted to about $430 million a year available free cash flow for distribution. I was sitting with the chief of, very close to Shannon's riding the Kamloops, and explaining what it would mean for the Kamloops Nation to own it. And I was going through the math in this Indigenous Sovereign Wealth Fund, and she said, Steve, I just got to stop you because I want to ask you a question. Do you have any idea what my nation earns from annual revenues for the surface lease on the existing pipeline? And I said, Chief, I don't have an idea. And she says, well, I'll tell you, $1,200 a year is what that nation was earning for surface lease rentals when there's hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of oil going through that pipeline every year. So this is key to the piece. I'm sorry to segue away from your question. I don't have the answer on what those tolls will be. The regulator will decide on what the percentage of that $35 billion will be factored into the tolls.
Okay, thank you. If you could just really quickly then, do you know the number, or have you looked at what the number would be for those rates to get a $34 billion valuation? Do you have that number or no?
I have a view on that number, but it's not something I would like to share in public.
Okay,
I will say that the shippers have other alternatives to having to pay that, and that's continue to put it in by rail.
Great. Okay, thank you.
And one of the strongest negotiators in the industry has been charged with negotiation. That might be a guy called Murray Edwards. So it'll be an interesting negotiation.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Dedamasi, I'm just wondering, given that we've heard about what the value for what this means to the economy for the pipeline, but also just given what the benefits of the oil and gas industry writ large mean to our economy, do you think that Canada could and should be building more pipelines yet to expand what we have?
I think Canada should take a strategic approach to building more and greater infrastructure projects related to energy and resource and across our natural resources base. Largely for a couple of reasons. It's been mentioned earlier, our reputation out there is a place that cannot do things and won't do things, and capital goes elsewhere. Secondarily, I believe doing so would foster a national sense of pride in the development of our overall resources, which I feel is lacking now. In my ideal world, the kid in Ontario would take as much pride in the Alberta oil sector as the Alberta kid does, and vice versa, right? The Alberta kid knows about Ontario mining and agriculture and forestry. I think we should develop a national sense of pride in these things.
Thank you. I will now go to Mr. Bruson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I thought it was interesting just to talk about the need to make sure that we're getting Canadian energy out to our allies and other countries as a point. I think it's an important point and gives me a moment to mark a bit of a celebration, I think, on this side, that C-49 has passed, and that means that our offshore wind industry for our Atlantic provinces is going to have many great opportunities, and I know that our European allies have certainly shown a big interest in what that might provide for us as far as green hydrogen. So just, taking that moment to kind of talk about the varied forms of energy that are available from Canada and what those opportunities might be. I actually was hoping to start maybe if I can ask Mr. Gooderham just one question, because we've been talking a bit about regulatory certainty. We've been talking about some of the issues about what are the impacts on emissions. You've been hearing a lot of conversation about this. And I was wondering, I was reading the Canadian Climate Institute report that was doing an analysis of Canada's emissions for 2023. And it actually showed some very promising signs for Canada's emissions dropping. And I was wondering if you'd had a chance to review that report.
Is that directed to me?
Yeah, sorry, that was you.
Yeah. No, I have not.
Okay.
I'm aware of. I'm aware of the general findings, and what I wish to say, and it's another important aspect of this whole question.
If I may, I'm sorry. I just wanted to jump in. I just wanted to check to see if you'd read it, because I only have a few more minutes. But it was just more, the reason I wanted to ask you about it was because they had found that the largest source of emissions dropping, the largest regulatory piece, was actually carbon pricing. Both consumer and industrial versions was projected to reduce emissions by as much as 50% by 2030. And I was wondering if you were aware and if you agreed with that analysis.
No, the answer is I haven't read it. But the problem is that all their numbers totally ignore our downstream emissions from our oil exports. So that that makes this whole discussion totally unreal. You can't go on talking about fine reductions in various sectors in Canada in the sense that it's getting us anywhere if we're increasing the downstream emissions from our oil production at a greater rate every year than any reductions we're getting in Canada.
So
net result to emissions.
Sorry, if I can, I hear your point there, but what I'm just trying to get to was actually about, we've been talking about regulatory certainty, and there's an issue of whether carbon pricing is actually seen to be the largest source of emissions. I'm just telling you, it's actually in the report, that's what they say, is that the carbon pricing is actually projected to be the largest source of emissions drops. So, but you haven't read the report, so
No, but I'm saying the emissions drop is insignificant in the context of the climate discussion.
Okay. Maybe if I can go to Mr. Toom, please. I also wanted to talk with you a little bit about carbon pricing, because I was taken by that study from the Canadian Climate Institute, and also about the fact that we're talking about regulatory certainty or uncertainty. I saw that you had actually done some studies, I think drawing on Statistics Canada information, about what is the impact of carbon pricing on Canadians and the carbon rebate. And so I just want to make sure I have that correct, but I think you were saying two things, which is one, that actually for Canadians who are low, median income, that the carbon rebate provides more to them back than they would get if there was no carbon pricing system. Is that correct?
That's correct in terms of the fiscal flows, which abstracts from the broader economic implications of carbon pricing.
Right. And then if I understood your comments about the economic piece, because I just wanted to clarify that piece, that comes up a lot as well. You were saying that any analysis right now, like for example, from the Parliamentary Budget Officer, doesn't take into account that the alternative is not to do nothing, like that there isn't a scenario where you would remove carbon pricing and then have no kind of regulatory scheme to deal with carbon. Is that correct?
Well, that would ultimately be a choice for the government of the day to decide what type of climate policy they wish to pursue or not.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. As chair, I just would like to ask, as chair of my prerogative, to ask a question of clarification to Mr. Toom. Have you looked at the impact to royalty revenue to the province of Alberta and done a cost-benefit analysis of looking at the direct and indirect benefits of the pipeline, so including the jobs and all the benefits that comes with building the pipeline, and what would that look like?
Yeah, and it's really hard to overstate the financial implications of the pipeline for the government of Alberta, where every $1 per barrel change in the value of what's produced here translates into about $630 million per year to the government of Alberta's bottom line. And so if we just take the $9 per barrel reduction in the differential, just for illustration, that's a little over $5 billion additional dollars in resource revenues to the government of Alberta. And that would just be the direct royalty implications, not any kind of the indirect gains through income taxation of a boosted level of economic activity.
Thank you, Mr. Toom. And if you do have more information on the indirect benefits, all the indirect benefits that you've done, I think that would be a benefit to committee members. I know that'd be a benefit to me and to folks across the country as well, particularly in my home province of Alberta. Thank you. We will now go to Mr. Dreeshen for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of the witnesses. First of all, I'd like to direct some questions to Mr. Ditomassy. You have your expertise in international business, and that's I think something that we had read when we had gone through your brief earlier, and you had talked about the global issues and the fact that we have 2 billion people that have no real access to energy and 4 billion that have a little. And so the rest of us act as though we are going to manage the whole world for them. And so I think that's really kind of part of it. And how we solve energy for the world's poor is something that we should recognize and be careful about. And there was also discussion about the sanctions as far as Russia is concerned. I had spent some time with the OSCE, and we were talking about energy security, food security, and of course security in Europe. And the discussion on sanctions, of course, what that had done is taken any European industrial base, reduced it to ruin. And so therefore, if the world is going to buy anything, it had to be bought from China or India. And so therefore, we supported the war effort that way. So the concept of sanctions was not really something that was going to solve a lot of problems. You also had talked about the idea of our American neighbors. And when on the first day of the last administration, they shut down Keystone XL. And so that stopped another source for our energy. So these are some of the issues that we deal with. And of course, we have people that talk about how you have to get rid of the oil sands. It was Mr. Byrol from the International Energy Agency that had indicated that the difference between heavy oil in Fort McMurray and conventional oil, if you took that differential as far as carbon is concerned, that the equivalent would be 1 day's emission in China. So, does it matter if China gets its act together on January 1st or January 2nd? But yet we are able to demonize an industry that means so much, not just for the world, as I had spoken about, but also for Canadians. I wonder if you could comment on some of the global aspects of Canadian energy.
Sure. A couple of things that you've mentioned. One is I think energy development has to be taken in context of everything else, of which climate is one, security is another, economic growth is another one, future generations. Sometimes I also think that our focus on climate obscures us to some of these other things that we might be paying attention to, including the one about energy poverty among the world's poor, which strikes a lot of them who I've talked to as just another neocolonialism. Given that we just had Indigenous Reconciliation Day, I think that was something we should think about. This appears yet another attempt to stop them from developing in a way that they deem, and it's dealing a lot of resentment. And the economic growth is what leads people to care about increasingly green policies. Rich people care about these things. Poor people, the evidence indicates, do not. So that's one. And there's many ways that we should be thinking about this globally. I mentioned the Americans, who are unpredictable at best, but we also used to have a very independent capacity in international affairs. That Canada was called a middle power. We won a Nobel Peace Prize for introducing the concept of peacekeeping. We had independent values that the world saw and stood for, and I think one of them is clean provision of energy, and others might be something that can harken back to, I wouldn't say good old days, but at least something that I think is worth remembering. So those are a couple of comments. I mean, it's a very big canvas you've opened up, but I'll start with that.
Thank you very much. And one of the discussions had to do with innovation, commercialization, and how people say, well, that'll never happen. But I do want to just mention, and because it's in my hometown of Innisfail, where there's a company called Deep Sky Labs that has just opened up its operation, to take about $100 million over the next 10 years. No government support in this. It is simply a commercial venture, and they're talking about different types of projects. So that it is a lab that is going to look at different ways of capturing CO2 and different things that can be done with this. So I think that's one of the important aspects. And just in closing. I've said that the colonialism that we speak about is environmental colonialism, and some people argue that that doesn't exist, but I do believe it does. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dreeshen. We'll now go to Mr. Badaway. Welcome to committee. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Toom with respect to the economic side of this project. Mr. Toom, you've been asked many questions today about the capital costs, about the financing of debt and how it's going to impact the operational side of the balance sheet. One thing that you didn't speak about is the extended costs as it relates to managing the asset, and between the life cycle, repair, maintenance over time, and ultimately at a point in time where there's going to be replacement. Two questions. One, I would like you to speak a bit about that, especially taking into consideration the escalating costs from the building side that we've experienced to date. But as well, if you factor that into your overall costing of the project 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
So that's a good question. My analysis is based on the financial filings from the Trans Mountain Pipeline in February of this year to the Canada Energy Regulator, which does include the costs of operating the pipeline, but also sustaining capital investments year by year, initially starting around 50 million, rising to a little over 80 by the 2040s. And so it's looking at that 20-year horizon and does include all of those other types of expenditures associated with the project itself.
And how would you evaluate the economic impact on Canada's oil sector and broader economy, taking into consideration the expected increase of exports, the export capacity, as well as market conditions, global demand for oil, as well as its profitability? But the flip side of it is, with respect to the greening, the direction the country's taken with respect to the greening, do you see some sustainability there? Do you see what's the longevity of it? And of course, with that, the profitability of it into the future?
That's a great question. I think it is important to keep in mind different ways in which the world might use oil less in the future have very different implications for Canadian oil production and the prices received here. If there is a reduction in the use of oil globally through supply-side policies that restrict production elsewhere, then that can be a world in which we have a lower use of oil globally, but higher oil prices. And that would tend to be associated in Canada with the trajectory of potentially rising oil production, even if global oil demand is falling. And in that kind of a world, it would be where Canada is among the final producers of oil globally in the future. Alternatively, if there's demand side policies, then that might be a state of the world where prices are lower, associated with lower oil use. And it's really hard to say which of these two scenarios we might be in. For the Canada Energy Regulator's more recent projections, even in a Canada net zero world, their baseline projection has oil production still rising in Canada out into the 2030s, and even as far out as 2050, producing still in Canada a little over 4 million barrels per day. So I'd say that climate policy and making progress on lowering emissions globally is not necessarily at odds with the viability and sustainability and financial returns that this project comes with.
And in terms of the project itself, how do you see it lending itself to transitioning?
So it produces revenue to governments, not just the provincial government in Alberta, but federally, the smaller differential translates into potentially on the order of about $2 billion additional dollars per year in corporate income tax revenues, for example. And governments can use these financial resources in different ways to, as you say, facilitate the transition, either by, in Alberta, we use a portion of revenues raised from the industry in support of clean technology subsidies and research and development, for example. So the additional economic and financial returns that comes with the pipelines gives us flexibility and more options. And that's true for economic growth in general. If we have a stronger economy, we just have a greater ability to tackle important future problems.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Badaway. We'll now go to our next speaker, and I believe Mr. Simard has given his time to Mr. Morris. So, Mr. Morris, you have 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur Simard.
Thank you, Mr. Simard.
I didn't have a chance to finish that exchange, and so it'd be reasonable to give you the opportunity to do that. I guess some of my, what I have going into this conversation, the UN Secretary General, his words, investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. You're telling us this is worth every penny. And so with limited time, feel free, maybe can you finish the thought? You were cut off earlier by time. And maybe would you be open to sending to this committee your analysis that includes the social cost of carbon that leads you to the conclusion you've shared publicly and at this committee?
So first, I would be very happy to share that analysis, no question. It's also based on the 2016 CER's Energy Future report at the time that thought about scenarios of pipeline capacity constraints and not. But I guess more directly to your initial question, I don't think about this as a binary choice. Emissions have environmental costs. That's the social cost of carbon. And we should be willing to incur costs up to the social costs of carbon to avoid emissions. And lowering emissions by blocking new pipeline construction has higher economic costs than the social cost of carbon. So I think we need to think about, at the margin, costs versus benefit, rather than everything just in terms of lowering emissions at all costs is appropriate policy.
Great. Yeah, I think it's helpful for this committee to see that analysis. So if you're willing to share it, please feel free to do that. I think it would help inform the full cost and implications of this pipeline. I got about a minute left, so I was going to turn to Mr. Gooderham. You'd mentioned the downstream emissions. We don't often talk about the reality that while our emissions are around 700 megatons, I mentioned the wildfires earlier, were around 647 megatons last year. The emissions exported, the oil we send to other places through actually diluted bitumen in the case of TMX to other countries, that's about 954 million tons. I think you started to get to that. The other reality we have in this country that if we want to have a chance of staying below 1.5, even a 50% chance, we need to leave 86% of our fossil fuel reserves unextracted. You're one of the few people who are willing to actually talk about production of emissions as opposed to only emissions themselves. Can you share briefly, I'm pretty much out of time, but maybe the implications of conversations like these if we don't talk about production as well?
Yes. Recently, the government, December 7th, 2023, issued its public discussion paper on a new scheme to move to how we put a price on emissions in the industry. But and it talks about this, the reductions this will achieve, in terms of our total emissions in Canada from oil and gas production in Alberta, we can reduce the emissions by so much without interfering with the growth of oil production. So we get a net reduction in the Canadian emissions. But meanwhile, that increased production, 85% of the emissions occur overseas when it's burned in, comes out as tailpipe emissions overseas. And those emissions warm the climate in Halifax and northern Alberta just as if they were emitted in Canada. So it's quite frankly, it's a fake game to say we're going to lower production emissions in Alberta, but we're going to increase them overseas. It will warm our climate more.
Thank you, Mr.
So that's my answer.
Thank you. We'll now go for 2.5 minutes to Mr. Boulerice. The floor is yours, sir.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Intervention is for Mr. Gooderham. It's not a question, it's a request. In August last year, you published a study titled Driving Global Heating to 1.7 and Above, the New Canada Energy Future 2023 report, and Canada's projected oil production to 2050. Is it possible to submit this study to the committee for the benefits of the analysts and the future report?
Yes, I will submit you a copy. And I will just comment that earlier one of the witnesses mentioned the Canada net zero scenario. But what's not been mentioned is that that scenario will drive warming to 1.7 or 1.8 degrees. That's not disputed. I will submit that, yes.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Mason, vous avez dans vos remarques.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mason. In your comments, you noted that Project Reconciliation, you minister, the Minister of Finance of the time, Bill Morneau, you submitted a proposal, and that's been a few years now. I'm curious, have you had more recent meetings with the current Minister of Finance or people from her office?
No, we haven't. We, as Minister Morneau said, when we tabled that first offer to purchase in July of 2019, we're just going to build it first. The federal government did open a consultation with the 120 nations in a meeting in Vancouver a year ago in August, and really the feedback, and we were asked not to attend, they just wanted each of the individual communities to be there. But our relationship, we basically got back that there was no deal tabled. Until there is, we're waiting. And I think the key really goes back to my other comment of the tolls need to get settled. And then that drives, when we went through the exercise, and as I mentioned, I was in and out of New York a few times. We had a rating agency give us a rating on a series of bonds. The debt service coverage ratio was well within line of 1.8 times. That made it financeable. And once we get the final tolls, we will come to the federal government and table a value that reflects the tolls and the commercial value around those.
Une des inquiétudes qu'on a de notre côté.
One of the concerns we have on our side, Mr. Mason, and I'm speaking as a member of... Oh, okay, time's up.
Thank you. We will now go to Ms. Stubbs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks again to all the witnesses here and also for your all your great explanations grounded in reality about the benefits of oil and gas development and this crucial economic infrastructure to all three levels of government, to every community in Canada, to every province, every region, and especially as an opportunity to move Indigenous people from managing poverty to managing prosperity, and for being here to tell the truth too, that the reality is that the majority of Indigenous communities in Canada support in some way or another responsible oil and gas development, resource extraction. And also, I'm glad to hear some recognition of the reality that, of course, it's the oil and gas sector in Canada that far and away beyond every other private sector, in terms of private sector investment, is the sector putting the most investment in clean tech and in innovation far and away by compared to any other private sector in the Canadian economy. So thank you all for raising those. Now, I just want to move my motion quickly. I'm hoping that our committee will move on it immediately, and then I'll cede the remaining time for remaining questions. So that motion, as colleagues will note, I have distributed, says, given that the committee, and thank you, is hearing from prospective buyers of the TMX pipeline in this study, and given that one of the prospective buyers is being heard by the committee today, for which we are grateful, the committee also invite representatives from Western Indigenous Pipeline Group, Natural Law, and Iron Coalition to provide their testimony at the earliest convenience. And I certainly do hope that if I'm missing any other possible proponents, that analysts will insert that. I just assume that all members will see the necessity in hearing from all prospective proponents on this topic, and I would anticipate we would all support this motion immediately, so we can go on for my colleague to continue questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. We now have a motion on the floor, and I have Mr. Bruson who is next. Go ahead, Mr. Bruson.
Thank you. I'm just a little surprised by needing to bring a motion to add witnesses to the list. As a committee, we add witnesses to the list all the time, and we have more meetings scheduled. So it's not the type of thing where a motion would be required. We keep on adding witnesses, as do the other parties. I have no problem with adding those witnesses to the list, so I'm not opposing the motion. I'm just not sure why a motion was required.
Thank you.
You're the one who took the time to do it. Wondering.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. We will now go to Mr. Patzer, and I'll go through the speakers list. Mr. Patzer, then.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just really quickly, I mean, these are some fantastic witnesses that I think that we could make sure that come to committee. Again, to make sure that they come at their earliest convenience. I think they would have very valuable insight to add to what it is that we are doing here with this particular study. So, I mean, with that, I would just move that we go to a vote so that we can just get this addressed and continue on with our witnesses here today.
Thank you, Mr. Patzer. I'll exhaust the list, and we'll try to do that quickly as possible. But we'll go to Mr. Simard.
Bon,
Far be it from me to want to belabor the point, but to my memory, when the PBO came by, he told us that he published a second report, and the date was mid-October, unless I'm mistaken. Perhaps the analyst can tell me. So I don't want to interrupt the debate and the proposal by Shannon, which is likely very interesting, but I think that we could talk next week. Perhaps we could have a meeting where we could hear from the PBO on his update, and we could have two witnesses. Perhaps it would be judicious to do that. But before we debate that, I'm wondering if we could communicate with the PBO's office that to tell us whether they will be indeed publishing the second report by mid-October. If Shannon is ready to debate the motion next week, we could add the PBO, and we'd have a really interesting session.
I would support bringing the PBO regardless.
So, I guess, are you requesting an amendment to include the PBO?
non, je demande simplement
No, I'm simply asking Shannon whether we could wait and debate this next week. And then, if I have all the information and, well, it seems to me that in his testimony, the PBO said, or he said in a private conversation, that's why it's not clear in my head, but I'd like to check when he tables the second report on Trans Mountain, the update that we had asked for. To my memory, it was mid-October, and perhaps if that is the case, perhaps we could plan a meeting for the PBO to present his new report and have additional witnesses. So could we push this discussion back to next week, and then everyone will have time to do their homework, and we can look at it then.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Simard, for that. I'm going to go to Mr. Boulderis next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to propose an amendment to add a First Nation to the witnesses requested by my colleague, but if there is acceptance to push back the discussion to next week, that might work well too.
I just confess that I don't necessarily see the hold up here. I think we can all immediately agree that we will, in an inclusive way, invite all of these other proponents. They will have important things to say on exactly these issues we are all discussing about whether or not the government has made this an asset that's difficult to buy. They could talk through all of that. I obviously support the PBO coming. I don't know that those things necessarily have to be together, and I don't think we need to really. It would surprise me if colleagues here wouldn't want all the perspective, Indigenous-led and Indigenous-owned potential proponents to be here.
Thank you, Ms. Stubbs. So, Mr. Boulris, you have the floor. I'm not sure what you want to move forward with, but if you do want to discuss this, we can continue on with the debate on the motion. Or you can take this, I guess, offline if you believe there's some other resolution you want. But I'll go back to you, Mr. Boulris, if you have an amendment or...
Un amendement, et puis c'est tout simple.
A simple amendment. It is to have a diversity of perspectives. Could we hear from First Nations who are affected? I would like to add the First Nation. I'm sorry, I will probably massacre the pronunciation. Tsleil-Waututh to the list. I think there are already two in the motion that was presented, and I would like to add the First Nation Tsleil-Waututh. And I can send the spelling to all of you. It's not what it sounds like.
We have an amendment by Mr. Boulris, and so I want to, on the amendment, Mr. Bruson, go ahead on the amendment.
Again, until now, we have always on studies been able to submit names of witnesses without having to bring motions. It's not a necessary part of the process. So, I mean, I would think we could also have an amendment that all of the parties can submit the names they want for witnesses for this study. And if you want to do like an extended date again, or like a rolling date, we could say to, I don't know, next Tuesday if we want. But we don't actually have to name the witnesses in a motion to get them invitations. That's not a rule of this committee or of the House that I understand.
Thank you, Mr. Bruson. And that I'm going to go to the next speaker. Is that okay? Okay.
Oui.
I'm going to go to you, Monsieur Smart, and then.
C'est une pratique qu'on a déjà utilisée.
It's a practice that we've already used to put the names of witnesses in a motion. We did that on the thorny issue of woodland caribou. The names were in the motion. It is a practice that we have used, but I understand what you're saying, Julie. And if we all agree for additional sittings, perhaps we could agree on additional sittings, and then we could meet the demand for all colleagues for the PBO, from Mr. Boulris, for the First Nations which I won't try to pronounce, and same thing for Shannon. So if we all agree on 2 additional sittings, knowing that in subcommittee we could perhaps propose, well, I'd be curious to hear from the PBO. Shannon could add the witnesses in her motion. Mr. Boulris could add his witness. And perhaps that would be a way to get around this impasse and wrap things up quickly.
Mr. Smart, before I go to you, Ms. Stubbs, I just want to clarify, Mr. Boulris, that witness has been invited. It is on our witness list, as the clerk has mentioned to me. So they're already on the list, just to let you know. And because I wasn't aware of that, but the clerk did bring that to my attention.
Dans ce cas-là, mon amendement devient caduc, qui n'est plus.
So my amendment is no longer relevant then.
Thank you. And so
Thanks, Chair. Can I go now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One,
Well, we have 5 minutes left, and what I wanted to allow was more questioning of the witnesses. So what I was about to say is, given all of this commitment, support for extra meetings and working this out, then yes, let's deal with it next week, and let's go on with the last 5 minutes for remaining questioning for the witnesses who have given their time of us today. And merci, Monsieur Simard, for
And thank you, Mr. Simard.
In line and for process.
Do we have UC then to unanimous consent to proceed back to the witness and to debate this next week? We do? Okay, across the board, we're great. Okay, let's go back to the witnesses. Thank you. We're going back to you, Mr. Falk.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for your patience. Dr. Tomby, I'd like to ask you a few more questions, in particular about the tolls and the pricing differential there of about $1.50. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Where do you think it should be? Why is it where it is?
Sure. So there's really no sense where I think the differential should or shouldn't be at any particular level. Lower the better from the perspective of Canada's economy. And it's going to tend to reflect the marginal cost of exporting a barrel. And so when producers need to resort to higher cost transport modes like rail or even sometimes truck, then the differential can rise quite considerably with implications for producers right across the board, even those who are using pipelines themselves. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but kind of generically, that's how I think about it.
I'm just wondering, have you done any preliminary type or surface level investigation as to some of the cost overruns in the pipeline project?
No, I would simply defer to whatever the CER comes up with its much more detailed information than I would have access to.
And the CER will base their decision on the cost of the construction as well as providing an adequate debt service level. Is that something that they consider, or do they not consider that? Do they just look at world markets and world pricing?
No, so in setting the toll, they look at many factors, but they do want to ensure the viability of the project itself. The idea is to set tolls that allow for sufficient returns to have a reasonable rate of return on the investments made into the project and no higher. So it's meant to avoid the kind of market power that a pipeline would otherwise have. And so think of it as setting a toll that just allows for a reasonable rate of return.
Okay, and that toll would benefit who?
So that toll covers the costs of the pipeline in the case of operations, debt service, and so on. And so the existence of the pipeline is of great benefit to both the sector and Canada's economy overall. So to the extent that the tolls actually allow for the existence of the pipeline, then the benefits accrue right across the board for Canadians in general, even those not directly involved in oil and gas.
Okay, so yeah, so the benefit, it would benefit Canadians. You had made a comment at one point that the Canadian taxpayer is not on the hook for the pipeline, but in the reading I've done is that the TMX Corporation was provided with a $17 billion loan directly from the government, another $18 billion of financing from the traditional banks, but completely backed by the government. So really the taxpayer is on the hook for the full $34 billion, the way I read it. Would that be accurate?
Well, thanks for allowing me to clarify that. I mean, they're not necessarily on the hook. They face risk. So the risk is that the pipeline's lifespan and capacity utilization wouldn't provide enough revenue to cover debt service and debt repayment. But there are many scenarios where revenue is sufficient to cover that. So taxpayers would, at the end of the day, not be facing that cost.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Badaway to finish us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And back to Mr. Toom with the questioning, sir. We spoke earlier, and near the end of our discussion, you talked about the transition cost and the accrual of some of the monies that would go to a cleaner social cost of carbon. And I wanted to expand that with respect to your thoughts on how relevant the carbon pricing, sometimes known as the carbon tax, is to lower the social cost of carbon.
So the carbon pricing system that's most relevant for oil and gas, and this discussion is the Alberta's provincial large emitter system, the TIER program. And that's a program that works fairly well, prices emissions of the industry, currently now at $80 per ton. And that's an example of something that, I guess not to make predictions about future policy, something where its continued existence and stability is important for investment in the sector. And the revenues from that are in part flow to the government, but also provide subsidies to research and development and technology adoption in the sector itself.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Badawi. Thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. And as mentioned earlier, you can submit an additional brief for questions you need to further expand on, or if other information you think would be beneficial to the committee, and you can send that directly to the committee clerk. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you, and look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future. All right, meeting adjourned.